really amazing conference. I'm learning a lot with data, and also the really great schedule. So like all the talks are so coherent within the others. And I hope mine will be like in the continuity of the ones presented by Anna and Marcus. So as Rav presented, I'm gonna try to like defend the idea that matter and memory can help bridging gaps and reconciliating the kind of love and hate relationship between analytic philosophy and Bergson's philosophy. Okay, and so just for starting points, so my PhD is on the function of episodic memory, as kind of presented, but also on Bergson, and I think it can bring a lot in this field. I'm not going to delve too much into this because it would take like so a long time. So I'm just, I'll be happy to talk about it later if you want. But the main starting point is that what I remember I was discovered memory in philosophy through Bergson, and when I arrived in my PhD, and I remember super vividly presenting the first talk I gave in front of analytic philosophers when I presented Bergson and analytic philosophy of memory. They were all like, "What is this idea, and how can it even be relevant?" And so for me, it was really striking how a lot of conceptual differences were existing between these two fields, and that a lot of misunderstood was still present in this field according to Bergson's philosophy. And also, I saw that, and so this work also emerges with the great project Alessandro and Caterina are doing with the bibliography. And while I was taking care of, I was taking care of the Great Britain, Northern America, and France region, I noticed that matter and memory is not that present in the field, which is, I think, super sad. But it's just as a title of number, even in France, there's like 27 references of mémoire or matter and memory out of 1,478, which is nothing. And so just as these numbers, it was kind of striking how matter and memory that is one of his most famous books and also one of his most complicated, is still today seen as less studied. And for example, Yosushi published a book in 2023 on scientific studies, modern sciences and matter and memory and its relevancy today. But like, even though there is much more work done on matter and memory, it's still one of the books that are less present in the field, it seems. And also, for example, yesterday a lot of talks were on the influence of the élan vital, the duration in the different traditions, but matter and memory and the two sources to take what Frédéric presented are still the less loved ones. I'm not saying that nobody studies them, but that these two books are less studied. So these were the starting points. And so today I want to reopen Bergson's matter and memory within the analytic philosophy of mind and the analytic philosophy of episodic memory. And also to suggest that there could be a philosophical reconciliation between these two traditions that be incompatible. Because of two things. First, the intuitive metaphysics of Bergson that Anna presented already a bit in her presentation, but also this idea in analytic philosophy of memory that the representational frameworks are the most important because of the cognitive sciences. And so the goal today is not to translate Bergson in analytic terms, because I think we could lose a lot, but to show that matter and memory, especially rather than the spiritual, inner spirituality, for example, is more plausible for this kind of discussion, because he suggested this functional conception of memory in matter and memory, and that it could enrich its current cognitive paradigms in cognitive sciences and analytic philosophy. And so the outline is as follows. First, an introduction, so I'm sure everyone is on the same line. Second, this idea that there are two philosophies of memory when we talk about Bergson philosophy of memory and analytic philosophy of memory, and it's kind of a love and hate relationship. mainly because of Russell. And I'm not going to delve too much, just a disclaimer, I'm not going to delve too much into the Bergson and Russell's debate, but just I'm going to show that it's mainly because of that Bergson is criticized nowadays. And lastly, I'm going to try to defend that matter memory is the best bridge to avoid a real breakup in these two traditions. So, as you know, matter and memory mainly is at the intersection of metaphysics, but also empirical psychologists. Bergson, if I'm not mistaken, it took like almost 5 years to write it, and it's so enriched with empirical cases from psychology and neurosciences of his time. And so it's kind of weird to say that, as Tobias was highlighting earlier, that he's not engaging with the science of his time. And so one of the questions Bergson's asking this work is what is the relation between body memory but also action, and it's like the subtitle of matter memory is the sur la relation entre l'esprit et le corps. And one of the problems is that analytic philosophy ignored Bergson after Russell's critique, that is from 1923, and mainly ignored him until nowadays. Again, I'm not saying that nobody studies him nowadays, but that he's maybe still misunderstood a lot, and that his involvement in the cognitive sciences is not seen as important as I think it should be. Can you hear me okay in the room? So matter memory is, as you know, the second major work of Bergson, here in 2023, and the introduction of his collection of papers presented as, I agree with this, as one of his masterpieces, but also one of the most challenging texts because of all the discussions with sciences, but also the conceptual and different problems that are inside the books itself, such as the problem between the metaphysical dualism, the reductive physicalism, even more the problems of aphasics, patients, for example, and all these questions that are huge problems within a single book. And as I was saying, I think that this book combines philosophy, but also metaphysician discussion, but also kind of scientific inquiry, because he really engages with the science of his time. And I think that this book particularly, I'll come back to it at the last session, trying to define why this book's the best one. But I think that this book seeks to reconcile experiences and science, but also mind and body through this dynamic theory of memory and perception. And I'll focus mainly on this interaction between memory and perception in matter and memory. So, as you know, and I'll go quite a bit quickly on this, as I just presented, that Bergson really engages. I'm really emphasizing with this because it's one thing that philosophy and analytic philosophy, they forget, that he really engages with the late 19th century psychology and neurology, and that he has all this speculative, but also super empirically informed passage, for example, in the second and third chapters of matter memory, but also in his classes that he gave in 1905 on aphasia, aphasia, apraxia, and also the huge theory of attention and recognition. And yet, as I said, this work, which is really enriched for anyone who opens a book or his classes, is still super dismissed by Russell, who saw this vagueness and anti-intellectualism. But I think that also it remains on what Anna was highlighting earlier, that the problem of all of this was mainly in the word of intuition that was seen as anti-scientific. And so the analytic work turned to this logical clarity, and the cognitive sciences weren't exceptions towards this. And because of that, Bergson remained on the continental shelf of this debate. And so today I'm trying to defend that, whether this exile was deserved or no. So the question here is not only historical, but also methodological. Because the analytic philosophy of memory, so when I'm talking about analytic philosophy today, I'm talking about analytic philosophy of memory. It privileges explanation, causal description, representational models of memory. But as I said, Bergson's intuition also aims at this comprehension from a different perspective. So the perspective is not external, but within at like trying to capture duration, continuity, life, and the spiritual experience, personal experience. So one of the main striking things when I started PhD was that both share a concern with function. So if you open macro memory in the introduction, Bergson said, and I'll come back to it later, that the psychological study should focus on the function of the mental states. And so even though the word function is differently understood, they still use it and try to take it as the role of the mental states. And so Bergson functionalism, so his notion of function is not computational, of course, but it's vital and it links, I think, cognition to the rhythm of life itself because of duration. And so I have three main questions that we'll find again in this presentation. First, can Bergson's intuition coexist with analytic rigor? Analytic philosophers who don't know about Bergson or who read about Bergson for the first time would say no. But I think it does without taking too much out of Bergson. We can still create this coexistency. Does matter and memory offer a neurally functionalism or phenomenology of action in this field? And lastly, why does memory matter? What does matter and memory, matter? And I think it's because it enables this bridge between consciousness and time. And so this phenomenological aspect that is emergent in the field of cognitive science and philosophy of memory, but that is still not that. So in the second section, I'll present these two philosophy of memory, and I'll go a bit quickly because I think many of you know the Bergson's theory of memory, which is a nice thing for me because usually it takes to explain. So I'll go a bit quickly, but I'll be happy to come back to it later. It's just for us to have the same background. Okay. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this analytic philosophy of memory is basically from this taxonomy that we can have in psychology and philosophy of memory, that memory is, like memory as this cognitive phenomenon, is divided into main categories. So can you see? Okay. You can see here declarative memory, that is memory you have with representations. Such as, for example, the mental images you can have when you recall that we ate yesterday evening, but also on the non-declarative memories. And the one that I focus on is procedural memory, which is the habit. For example, if you learn how to walk, when you walk, you don't think about how you do to be able to walk. You just do it because it's a result of repetition and of the skill you learned. And so in the declarative memory, we usually differentiate between two types of memory: semantic memory, that is a memory of general information. It can be personal, but it's, for example, the fact that you know Istanbul is not the capital of Turkey, but Ankara is. But you have also the memory of events, that is what we call episodic memory, which is my focus today. And episodic memory is the memory you have of you arriving in Istanbul 2 days ago, for example. So this personal experience you have of the past. So focus on episodic memory, which is a declarative kind of memory. This idea that you can represent your past and the sort of mental images, for example. And there's this distinction between non-declarative and declarative memory, which is focused on conceptual memory. And with a little bit of spoiler, as you know, that people have it. So it comes back to Tolving, who is the kind of the father of this distinction. And Tolving presented episodic memory as characterized by automated consciousness, that is the self-aware recollection of a personal past event. And remembering, episodic remembering, is this representation of the past. And it's personal past. I'm not talking about collective past. And so in the analytic tradition, memory is conceived as this system of representation. So there's an encoding of your information, a storage of your information, and a retrieval. So what you retrieve right now is something you experience. You keep it as a trace, for example, as like neural connections, and then you retrieve it in the present. And so they explain this continuity of the self, for example, through causal processes. And this model is really computational in the sense that you understand and we explain memory through the neural explanation. So how does it work in the brain? And so the thing is that it can miss the lived temporality of the remembering. So explaining how it works in the brain or how the different kinds of memory interact doesn't explain the subjectivity of the experience of the past. That's, I think, Bergson can bring. And so, and here I will go a bit quickly, as I said, as you mainly know, Bergson's philosophy of memory defends this idea that the past is not stored because it's duration, but it endures this virtuality and it actualizes itself according to the need of the present. And so therefore, Bergson anticipates this phenomenological, what I call phenomenological functionality, that is this function of enabling self-continuity and self-experience, where memory for Bergson is an act, a dynamic reinsertion of the past, and not something that is an archive. And so really quickly again, Bergson defining this idea of two kinds of memories, perspective, second and third chapter of matter memory. And there is the habits memory, so this motor automatic memory that is the result of repetition and the skill. You mainly all know this example of the lesson that Bergson gives. When you learn a lesson, you have these different kinds of moments. When you learn the lesson, for example, I'm with some friends, and these are part of what he calls pure memories. So this specific dated, I'm quoting him, past moments, and you have the habits memory. That is the moment you learn the lesson by heart, and you're able to say it again without thinking, and it's the result of repetition and this automatic behavior. While the pure memory is virtual, but in the stage of in the present, it can be reactualized as a representation in the type of image, what he calls image. And so this pure memory is also present in the recognition. I don't have time to talk about it today, but I'll be happy to talk about it later if you want to. And so mainly habits memory links the body to useful repetition, learning, or automatisms, while pure memory comes from the totality of the past duration in a virtual form. And I think that this is a huge problem for analytic philosopher, but it can be accepted if we call it disposition, which is a term that analytic philosopher take as coherence, which are like the possibility of I'm going to talk with Bergsonian term, but reactivating past experiences. And so in matter memory, remembering is I'll go a bit quick on this, but mainly analytic philosophy, you have declarative, representational memories, episodic, semantic memory, and non-representational memory that is other priming, for example, but mainly procedural memory. And this distinction can be interestingly seen in Bergson's philosophy of memory between actualized pure memory, that is image memory, but also non-representational memory, that is habit. And so, as you know, Bergson was rejected from analytic philosophy, even though he was really friendly with William James, who recognized his shared effort to articulate this dynamic and evolving nature of consciousness, and he enabled him and Bergson's recognition in the word, of course, word-wide recognition, sorry, to discuss with different groups, give different conferences in the US. But even though he was embracing this Manchurian scientific circles for his theory on evolution and progress, it was less the case for pure memory. And as you know, his influence declined, and what it was striking when I did the bibliography was that starting from Bergson's critics around 1920, 1930, it's a huge definition, like he's almost absent. And so I think it's really interesting to see how Russell was important at that time. And so philosophy, as you know, became dominated by scientific rigor, linguistic precision, logical structure, and Bergson's method of intuition contrasted for them with these analytic ideals, because knowing from the within through lived experience and movement, that is the method of intuition, was opposed to analysis that breaks with the phenomenon into conceptual elements, for example. And so Bergson, as you perhaps know, and again, I'm not delving too much into this debate, but mainly his main criticism was that Bergson was overlying on immediate intuition, and that he was promoting instinct over intellect, as Anna a bit presented a bit earlier, and the talks yesterday also presented with this criticism of Bergson being an anti-intellectualist. And so the result is that Bergson's metaphysics, present in matter memory, was distinguished, seen as opposed to the psychological study he could bring and the empirical study that were more present at this time. So he was dismissed as vague and inside of vague. But I think that there might be a problem with communication in all of the psychotic relationships. And so I think that Russell mainly, and still today, there's a huge misunderstanding of Bergson's aims. I don't think he wanted to reject science. Even in his class of 1905, he says that perhaps science can bring some new insights in the future. But I think he wanted to complement science by addressing this lived temporalism, phenomenology of consciousness that in all that sense overlooks, because especially nowadays we still have this computational perspective on cognitive abilities. And so intuition, I think, is not emotion as Russell said, but maybe a method to grasp this dynamicity, continuity, and internal realities, such as the ones of life, memory, and consciousness. And intelligence, I think, dissects the inner spatial and repeatable thing that is related to analysis, and that I think Russell really focused on. So I don't think they're opposed. I think they can be complementary. And what is interesting is that in the recent studies by Passerelle, but also Matière, there is new emergent analytic dialogues between philosophical biology and creative evolution, and also Yasushi and Bert McElligan were publishing these papers and discussion in Bergsonian and soon highlight this renewed convergence between the analytic method as a scientific explanation and the Bergsonian intuition as metaphysical insight into lived temporality. So, for example, he said that Yasushi has this idea of a multi-time scale understanding of memory, matter memory, and Bergson's philosophy of time. And so in matter and memory, Bergson, I think dualism is dynamic and not as strict as you know, but as analytic philosophy, well, philosophers don't know and don't want to know, is that the dualism, I don't think, is that much a problem because it offers this alternative to Russell's rigid split between metaphysics and science through this interaction between matter and spirits. And so lastly, why matter and memory? I think that, as I said, the recent studies, as I said, revealed the unexhausted potential of his thinking of life as a creative moment. So Mathilde, for example, reused the concept of élan vital to present how we can think about agency in animals in the book she published in 2024. And I think it shows that some work can be done today again on Bergson's philosophy and concepts for new ideas and theories in the psychological field as in the scientific areas in general. And so Bergson's conversion of perspective, I think, from this internal perspective in duration replaces and complements this mechanistic explanation with this intuition of life's inner dynamism in her perspective. And I think we can do the same for memory. And again, I think in this case, memory could be understood not only as, I'm not saying that it should be either one or two, but I think it can be really complementary, and memory in this case could be understood not only as the storage of information that we can find in cognitive sciences and that are relevant. I mean, like we have stable evolution of sciences, empirical findings, and I don't think they have their own insights, but I think that matter memory and Bergsonian philosophy can also bring this dynamic act of consciousness and help understand this. And so why Matière and mémoire? You could say perhaps creative evolution could be a best understanding to understand the biological function, for example, of the memory. But I think that matter memory, interestingly, is always in the background. People don't want to talk about Bergson, but they still refer to Bergson as present as an influencer for phenomenologies, for example, because it explores this idea of our experience of memory and recollection, such as what is presented in the Doudja, who is a neuroscientist, which is important to decide, and a philosopher. last year, but also from Tolving himself, sorry, this idea that episodic memory is oriented to the past, but he quotes that Henri Bergson wrote about the pastness memory. They had in mind what we now refer to as episodic memory, even if they did not use the term. So they also, matter memory is always in the background in the sense that they acknowledge this importance of the theory for the current taxonomy of memory itself, and the importance of this distinction between different kinds of memory, but maybe even more importantly, the importance of the phenomenological aspect of the matter and memory. And so, echoing Tolving in the literature's definition of episodic memory, the conscious recollection of a rich temporally and personal specific past, which is how people defend and have this consensus of the definition of episodic memory nowadays. Bergson writes that the overwhelming majority of our memories concern the events and details of our lives whose essence is to have a date and consequently never occurs. So it's quite striking that people don't think he can be relevant, even though like he talked about it in different terms, and we have to think that the environment, psychological environment, was really different also with all the advances we have in sciences nowadays. And so the thing is that, as I presented, the definition of memory are kind of similar in this kind of memories. So we could say that perhaps he's only relevant for the ontology of memory, so for thinking about the nature of memory. But I think that there is paradoxically where there can be a huge difference and perhaps the biggest misunderstanding because of the metaphysical part of pure memory. And which is the main question people ask all the time. What do you do with pure memory? But I think that if we take this taxonomy and we look over a functional perspective, we can bridge a better understanding between both traditions. So, for example, Bergson, as I said earlier, quotes in the introduction of Matter and Memory that psychological analysis must constantly take account of the utilitarian character of our mental function, essentially directed towards action. So he has this idea, I think, my reading at least, is that the way he understands memory and the psychological analysis in the sense of the role of the memory and the past recollections, the past recollections in our current life. And so this process of remembering reconciles, I think, the dualism, and we can understand, as I said, this position as what he calls a virtuality. And I think that image memory in the recollection, in the episodic remembering can be, because it's in the form of a mental image, can be helping the process and then the understanding on how episodic memory works and what it could do for us in our daily life and subjective life. And so I think that because of that, Bergson's influence of memory study is not merely historical, but I think it remains philosophically relevant, mainly because of, as I said, his conception of memory transcends the analytic Bergsonian divide by reconciling the mind and body dualism. He's not strictly, as you may know, that the mind and the body are completely distinct. They're connected and they interact through memory, through the recollection, and the phenomenon of recall. And so I think that in analytic philosophy, the focus is made on the phenomenon of recall too. And so through this process and the function of how the past emerges in our present through the mental representation, we can bridge a conversation between the two and to understand memory as a function and not a mere storage, which is something that is discussed in the cognitive sciences. Memory traces, for example, are seen as dynamic. They can change depending on the inputs you can have in the present life. So I think in this sense, he can be really interesting to be discussed. If not, my PhD would be completely useless, but I think it is, mainly because of this not strict distinction between the brain and the mind. And so I think that Bergson could bring this idea that memory is a dynamic function, serving this present action and serving perception. So memory can enrich our perception and have this bidirectionality with perception by being also enriched by our perception. And so in the sense, I think Bergson anticipated modern theories that we can find nowadays and that are really emergent new in the cognitive sciences and philosophy of memory. There are, for example, the embodiment theories, which defend that your memories can be enriched by your environments. and can be recalled by your environment, but also reenactment. So it relies on this embodiment theories, and also it can relies on predictive processing to get it. You can recall something, some information you can have, but also meaning on the ecological perception. So you see all these different theories that are now present in the literature, scientific literature, were already present as like small germs in matter and memory. And so memory can be anticipatory, adaptive, sorry, and oriented toward this efficient action rather than reproduction of the past, which is the main purpose of my PhD. And I'm finishing in 1 minute. And so, as I said, I think we can pass this because I just presented it. So Bergson philosophy engages directly with the science of his time, as I said. So why not today? Why not still engaging him with the science of his time? So he, as I said, presented some empirical bases on pathologies and so dysfunctions, such as aphasia and brain lesions, revealing the mind-body relationship, but also the functional perspective, functional role of memory and the remembering phenomenon in our subjective life. And so Miyake, for example, in the book and the collection of papers Yasushi published, presented this idea of aphasia presented in Bergson, anticipated embodied cognition through this dysfunction of motor function and the problem on representations. And so just to conclude, quickly sum up, I tried to reconnect Bergson's insight with contemporary philosophy of memory and cognitive sciences, and to propose a re-evaluation of matter and memory in an era dominated by analytic philosophy and cognitive sciences. And I think that matter and memory is the best candidate, mainly because it's one of the most difficult also, but because of its richness. And I'm not saying that my work is the only one doing this. As I mentioned, Yasushi presented, and I'm in the line of his work where he explores the links between Bergson's work and modern scientific thoughts to emphasize the relevant aspect of this kind of discussion, with a lot of different aspects between Bergson's matter memory, ecological perception, Bergson matter memory, and embodied cognition, and all of this work. But mine focuses mainly on the function of study. And so I think that this cross-cultural study can echo Bergson's view of time as flow and rate, and transformation can bring things also to the literature of memory, and that matter memory remains the key to understanding consciousness as this creative becoming, and understanding better the phenomenology of memory and episodic remembering, and bridging this analytic rigor and phenomenological intuitive depth. And so I think that his philosophy can bring insight on phenomenology, as I said, but mainly on the function, because a lot of people don't talk about the function of memory. Bergson's matter and memory, well, it's present in his introduction, and I think it's really important to study this and emphasize this in the literature nowadays, because it will be one of the main insights he can bring to the literature to avoid any huge and important breakup, let's say, between the two literatures. And so, just a conclusion, as Roms presents and said in his introduction to matter and memory regarding Bergson dualism, that the problem calls for revisited. And I think that nothing can be more true than this nowadays. And I think that I try at least to take this as an invitation to extend matter and memory beyond dualism itself, but to revisit matter and memory problems and the current literature, and even from this perspective of the function. And so my aim was to show that matter and memory stands at the junction of contemporary domains such as biology, evolutionary psychology, psychological analysis, metaphysical time, contemporary cognitive theory, etc., etc. And so I think that because of that, matter and memory could be the best candidate to avoid this huge breakup between the two literature. And so thus I think that rereading matter and memory today, having a bit of courage and facing the complexity of the book can be a big shift from this ontology of things to ontology of processes in the current literature of memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for cette présentation. La parole est
Thank you very much. You had three conclusions, three slides for conclusion. I was always waiting that it was ending, but since it is so concentrated and so kind of like a new challenge to bring a link. This is really a revolutionary challenge. I can say to have a link between analytic philosophy and Bergson, which needs to be done, and also one of the also clues for this being revolutionary to save memory from being an archive or data to be an action or act or function. That is also, something that could be open new bases in science that should be studied on. And you have a huge effort of Japanese Bergsonian school on this matter and memory, which is good. But the only thing I'm a little bit, I have some concern about it. If you take only matter and memory to focus on, then would it be, in terms of Bergson, would it be partial? Because there is, creative evolution, there is vitality, there is also intuition. If you take only matter and memory, would that help you to be so clear? This kind of question to think about, and maybe Yasushi also could talk about it. But I really, it is fascinating to have a new window in Bergsonism.
So I'm thank you. So my purpose is not only to use matter and memory exceptionally, because in my work I use determinate function on instance of biological function too. So creative evolution is useful for this, and the classes he gave are useful too. And some conferences he gave in energy strategy are useful too. But it's just that I think that matter and memory is still one of the books that is less present in the literature because of the pure memory issue. I call it an issue because it is for analysis for you guys less, but if it was an analytic conference, it would have been. And I think that because of this, I think my concern was to show that we can go amongst this this concern and this problem, this metaphysical divergences, I would say, to bring something new from this book that is, I think, seen as too complex, too rich, to everything. So, and that's why I think matter and memory today, I think sure that it's still useful, even though it is complicated. But I'm not saying that other books are useful.
Thank you very much, Peter. This was very rich and helpful, and I also share your passion for memory. I put a straightforward question. Do we still need to bring Bergson in contact or in exchange with philosophy? If, and I would like to have your stance on this, mainstream analytic philosophy is still dominated by this representation, this paradigm. So this would be my question. Can you elaborate a bit? So Bergson at this time is not the only author who's investigating new psychology, psychopathology, and the emerging neurosciences in the 20th century. But there was, let's say, more holistic grasp on mental phenomena, for instance, in Gestalt psychology, works of Hoffer, Ehrenfeld, and I guess this that already went against, was a movement against psychophysics, for instance, when we discussed in this first work. So from all this, and you already mentioned a lot of what I'm aiming at. So these have a renewal actually in embodied in active theory, mediated by Merleau-Ponty, who already drew a lot of this, Basira, and who actually brought this to cognitive sciences. And so my question is just like, maybe, I think in activism there's a problem, maybe the concept of representation is not a problem. I just think like, why should we not bring Bergson in contact with phenomenology that is already in dialogue with analytic philosophy? Why should we bring this mainstream analytic philosophy that is still captured, if this is the case? I would like to stand on this.
So, as I said, my talk is on the function, and I think that in natural memory, one thing that is quite striking and interesting, at least for me, is that is this current bidirectionality between perception and the memory itself. And I think in functional literature of memory nowadays, you have this idea that memory is for imagining. I'm saying really, maybe we can talk about it a bit. That memory is either for imagining. Some other people say that memory has this epistemic value because of the past preserved. And other people are saying that it has this social, this epistemic authority in social context. And so within these three perspectives, there's one that lacks, that is something related to the present. So both of them are mainly towards the future or what's the past. But I think that Bergson can bring this insight towards a function related to the present action. And that's why I think it can be useful in this literature, because he's one of the main representing this theory. But I think that he can be really relevant for the phenomenology of memory, which is quite a bit different from all the phenomenological, the philosophy of phenomenology we can have with Merleau-Ponty, that is maybe for an analytic philosopher only what do you experience when you recollect the past. And so I think that for this, he can bring this continuity and this relationship between your past and your present self, because there are all this problem in the literature about the reliability of your memory, the reliability of the past. And I think that for this, it can be also useful. But my main person, what he says about this interaction between perception and memory.
Yes, Sushi wants to say something. Yes, Sushi?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah. See.
Sushi.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yeah,
do.
no, we hear you. We hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now, okay. It's great to see you all. So, and yeah, great. And I thank you for your great presentation for your presentation, Doudja. So, and quoting the Japanese, articles and text, and yeah, and yeah, my question is related to the notion of translation you used in the beginning of your presentation. So, yeah, so the translation. So when we try to, across the border, yeah, we need to somehow the way to, invent a new way of translation. But the translation is not a reduction, as you know. So this is not the case that so we Bergsonian reduces somehow Bergson's, ideas and theories into their more, adaptive way to their context. But this should be bidirectional extension, So not only we brings new, point of discussion, but also they gives us a new, inspiration. That both in this way we have, a new, horizon of the investigation. So that with that, so my question is, you in this presentation you said that in the matter memory is the best the text to bridge these two traditions. And in that case, there are several, difficult, hard concepts which they do not want to understand, for the most hard one is a pure memory, of course. But besides that, you mentioned to the notion of virtuality. So this notion is already very important to incorporate in in our discussion, which is which is absent in the discussion of analytical philosophy of memory. So yeah. So what would you do? How would you translate this notion of virtuality? So even among the Bergsonians, so there are no firm solid consensus. So, but I think this is very second rich source of inspiration for Bergson philosophy of memory. with responding to the side question, so of course the material memory is his core starting point of his philosophy of memory, but this goes to the Collège de France lectures at his HTM, Histoire de théorie de la mémoire, and after that, so there are a bunch of articles that are written there, and then so they are incorporated into the energy spiritual, creative mind in English. Yeah. So for him, so this notion of this concept of memory is not just the just about the matter of memory, but it develops and evolves throughout his philosophical career. So, but throughout this development, there are always the notion of dynamic grasp of the memory. So the first lecture of the Histoire de théorie de la mémoire, he introduced the distinction of pure intuition and analysis, so the two, different ways to approach to the philosophy of memory. So for Bergson, the dynamicize the methodology of the philosophy of memory itself is, the first priority. So from that respect, so the notion of virtuality seems to be important. So how would you what would you do with this notion to so plant into this new horizon of, or the place of discussions? This is my question.
Okay, thank you. So it's really great to see you, and thank you for attending first. So I think it's, as you mentioned, one of the huge problems, because even in translation, people still use virtuality, and it relates to not something that is cognitive for analytic philosophers, but I think that in the literature of dispositions and the literature of traces, we could find some responses in like for a possible translation. Sorry, mainly because I think that without buying all the dispositions, consequences of memory traces and physicalism, materialism we can find with this, I think the proper concept of disposition has this idea of virtuality in Bergson, that is, it can be reactualized. And I would say tentatively, but I would of course need more time to think deeply about this, because I think that the concept of virtuality can be, one risk could be that it could be reduced by the idea of disposition. It doesn't endorse this dynamic that we can find in virtuality. But I think that's a way to understand it could be, I would say disposition in terms of analytic philosophy of memory, because cases can be dynamic in the phenomena of recall. So I think,
but tendency or inclinations or
that's
that lines up.
I think Sankara defends something like this. I think tendency could be, one worry I would have with tendency would be that it could lead to habit. More than something creative and something new that I think I still have with the virtuality. Well, that the tendency is something that sounds more repetitive. But I definitely read more about it.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the present. It was really understanding. My question is, Bergson argues that the ontological difference can be overridden by focusing on functionality, and psychology should focus on the function of mental states. However, when it comes to analytic philosophy of mind, these questions are important, especially to understand the relationship between mind and world. So in that sense, an analytic philosopher may think that Bergson's philosophy potential philosophy of mind is in this sense, reductive and superficial. So my question is, how does Bergson overcome the necessity of understanding this relationship, like the relationship between the mind and world, and how these two, if they are ontologically different, how they interact with each
So his idea in the that Worms presents in his last book, I think, but also in the second and third chapter of memory, is that it's with the process of recall. Because memory, so the pure, if I understood correctly your question, tell me if I misunderstood something, but that's so the mind is different from the body because the pure memory is spiritual, but the habit memory is related to your interaction between the body and the world. But Bergson defends that both, even though they are different in kinds, they still interact through the process of recollection. So when you have a mental image of your past, for example, you have it because of the interaction your body has with the words. That's in another term we would call cues, but also that is from your past experience of, for example, coming here yesterday, let's say, that is react. And like the interaction you have with the present. So one way through this function of how the memory is recalled, you could go against this reductionism, I guess, because if there are different kinds, they can still interact. That's why the function, I think, is better to understand this and to avoid this analytical terms, sorry, rather than the ontology of memory and the nature of memory.
So it kind of how to say structures his system in a different way than the analytic philosopher do.
Yeah, we can talk about it later.
Thank you very much, Guido, for your presentation. I was like, I'd like to ask you, I don't know almost anything about analytic philosophy, but in my like because there's a lot of working on it. How this non-reception of Bergsonian analytic philosophy depends on the mainstream meta philosophy of analytic philosophy, and how last decade studies on non-canonical figures of analytic philosophy, like following the canon of analytic philosophy with studies of women analytic philosophers or non-canonical figures, can provide with a framework in which we can show another meta philosophy, chronic philosophy, like once I talked about the Margaret MacDonald that mentioned Bergson in her like section of the reasoning and the importance of arguments for philosophy. How these historical studies can work for a framework in which we can show that analytic philosophy is not just the mainstream one, but there are other, because there's a mainstream, there's also a mainstream of the historical, and how this can work with the framework in which actualization of Bergson in case for memory and memory, but also for other fields of philosophy could be easily received and opposed.
Okay, so it's a tough question because I'm not sure I have an answer, but I would say that so if I got you right, like your question was like how is metaphilosophical and historical background at this time could help a better and easier understanding of Bergson nowadays in the reception.
Like if there's a mainstream meta-philosophy, analytic philosophy. Now we are questioning this the mainstream narrative. That's the question about the mainstream narrative. I don't highlight on non-mainstream meta-philosophy or analytic philosophy. Would like invalidate the non-reception and the non-dialogue that was proposed by the mainstream narrative, but the non-mainstream one.
Okay.
So that is historical researches would provide with a more like a welcoming environment for the conformization because of on theoretical.
Okay. So thank you. I didn't share very good. I think that is what you call so this interesting because I think that the main focus was the huge revolution of neurosciences and cognitive automations, but it doesn't mean that at this time there is no study at all philosophical perspective on memory, because since Aristotle and Plato, memory has been a huge topic, but I think there's still a lot of studies on perception. I don't recall the names of the studies, but used from matter and memory or creative perception for this biological perspective. And I think that I should take a look more on this but I think it could be interesting just to show that even though these neurosciences progress, neurocognitive progresses through mental industry, for example, were a revolution, it doesn't mean that the philosophical discussion stopped before that, and maybe the non-knowledgeable discussions and all this discussion of perception and stuff, they just were perhaps less revolutionary than the scientific advances. All the analytic turn, I think the analytic philosophers maybe turn towards the scientific revolution, forgetting perhaps that there was still philosophical discussions and philosophical debates. And I think that's perhaps showing that these debates were still useful and still preeminent at this time, and discussing some of Bergson's work, perhaps not memory that much, but other books could show that even though this was revolution, this was still bringing discussions and could always today bring discussion and evolution towards Bergson understanding and Bergson perception, not divided from this neurocognitive and new revolution, but with its. So I'll take it bring a better framework to understanding a correlation rather than a clear distinction as they did at this time. Thank you. But I think about it.
Yeah.
Sorry. You can talk to you.
There is another one?
Yeah.
Yeah, short.
Of course. Thank you for your very rich presentation. I just was wondering, because as we talk on the break, I always wondered whether matter and memory, in the light of the newest scientific developments, like the sciences and so on, has been some parts of it has been outdated, and did you find a trace of some, I don't know, some part of this reflection of Bergson's on memory or on body or on brain, for example, not valid anymore? To put it in context, translate in my field, for example, after the decisive experiments that confirmed the dilation of time, Bergson's reflection on acceleration become outdated, and this is actually for me an opportunity to develop a sort of continuance of his thought, taking into account these new scientific developments, new factors, and to develop his thoughts, the contemporary and the contemporary findings, the continuance of his philosophy of physics. And to back to your field, did you find some mistake or something like that? That would be the area of your.
So it's not much data because they have to be super brief, but I think that the main one would be the fact that memory is not encoded in the brain.
We have to be here at 2 o'clock. It is a little bit short, but we will have lunch and this should be a little bit quick. We have 2 more sessions and a conclusion after in the afternoon.